B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Juneteenth, Friday, June 19th, 2020. And all eyes this weekend are on Tulsa, Oklahoma. And if I were a praying man, I'd be praying for peace on the streets of Tulsa. As the Trump mobs descend on Tulsa for Saturday's rally moved from today after Trump discovered a thing called Juneteenth. Now, I am hardly the best informed white man in America, but I have known about the Juneteenth celebration for at least 15 years. And Trump says one of his black Secret Service agents tipped him off that none of the white people on his staff in the White House had any idea that they would be stepping on sensitive toes, or any knowledge that 99 years ago there was a massive confrontation between blacks and whites on the streets of Tulsa. So there were many efforts to get Trump to back down. He did shift by one day the date of his mob rally. But an effort was made, a lawsuit filed by local residents, business owners. They asked the Oklahoma Supreme Court to intervene and cancel the rally because many feared it could lead to a massive spread of the coronavirus. And today, the Oklahoma Supreme Court rejected the call for a temporary injunction. The court said that the state's June 1 reopening plan allowed business owners to use discretion over social distancing measures, and they were not mandatory, so there was no basis to cancel the event. Now, the arena, the BOK Center, or BOK, I guess they call it, holds about 19,000 people, but they're expecting far more to show up. And it's just a mile or so from the African-American Greenwood section of Tulsa. Now, I've never been there. I'm basing this on news accounts and secondhand information. But African-American leaders had actually canceled the Juneteenth observance in Tulsa because of the pandemic. And once Trump announced that he was flying in to disturb the peace and hold one of his rallies, they said, well, in kind of an act of defiance, they announced that they would reinstate their observance. And Al Sharpton is flying in to give an address to Tulsa on Friday night, tonight. And next year is the 100th anniversary of what is described as a massacre of black people in the spring of 1921. So the ignorance that is magnified by Trump's arrogance, and by his determination to feed racist white voters while pretending that he's no racist. He's previously proclaimed that he is the least racist person he knows. As if that has any relevance. But millions of Americans are observing Juneteenth this year. Corporate employers have given people the day off at Twitter, Nike, Target. It's a paid holiday. Virginia and New York have declared that it's a paid holiday for state employees. The state of Minnesota, its Governor Tim Walz has called on the legislature to establish it as a state holiday, and Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York said that starting next year, Juneteenth would be an official city and school holiday. So Trump told one reporter who asked him if he knew the significance of Juneteenth, and he just dodged the question by saying, well, but I've made it more famous and better known than it ever was. Nobody had ever heard of it, he declared, which means he had never heard of it, and, he thinks everybody's like him. Now, one of the things that raises the racial tensions in Tulsa, which is, by the way, 54% white and about 15% black, is that on June 6th, a white security guard who formerly worked as a jailer for the Tulsa Sheriff's Office, and a guy who has a newly revealed track record of racist behavior and mistreatment, he has been charged with first-degree manslaughter after he provoked and then killed an unarmed African-American man at a motel parking lot in Tulsa. The dead man is Carlos Carson, 36. He was unarmed. Apparently had some dispute with the motel operator. And this guy, Christopher Strait, the white former jailer, was working security at the motel. So Carson was a guest there. He was asked to leave earlier in the morning after complaining that his car was vandalized, and he got upset. So Strait, the security goon on duty, got out of his truck and without provocation sprayed Carson with pepper spray. Carson then confronted Strait. They fought as Carson attempted to pull Strait out of the car. And then, seconds later, Strait shot Carson in the head. Strait later admitted to police that Carson did not actually make an aggressive move toward him to provoke him. He told investigators he'd used the pepper spray to deter him from being aggressive and planned to hold him until the police arrived. And Carson has a brother who's an active duty Tulsa police officer, Ananias Carson. And he said that his brother was a good dude who loved his family. He did not deserve to be killed in that manner in a totally unprovoked situation where this white man just felt that he had the right to do whatever he wanted to do when he wanted to do it. And I'll just briefly say that all the way back to 2005, Strait's personnel file shows he'd been reprimanded for several infractions. He was demoted once in 2005. Then in 2018, he was demoted again, and that's when he resigned from the department. He was the subject of many complaints from prisoners and a colleague at the jail. So he has a pretty ugly history. And it is expected that the name of Mr. Carson will be invoked by protesters, Carlos Carson, I wanted to get that right, in Tulsa this weekend. And just to add to the tensions, Trump, who is now the biggest sheriff in the country, right? He tweeted this threat. Any protesters, anarchists, agitators, looters, or lowlifes who are going to Oklahoma, please understand, you will not be treated like you have been in New York, Seattle, or Minneapolis. It will be a much different scene. Now, this is bizarre because we saw extreme brutality in New York, in Seattle, and in Minneapolis. So, is he saying that kid gloves will be used, that there'll be no brutality or rioting by the police? No tear gas will be used if there is any kind of attempt to break up the crowd? And the mayor in Tulsa has issued a 10 p.m. curfew. So it's a scene that could certainly get quite skittish. And I hope it doesn't. But this is an unnecessary provocation from Trump. Number one, he doesn't need to hold these rallies at all. It's to feed his narcissistic need. And he vamps up there spewing out all kinds of falsehoods and name-calling, fake news, demonizing the media who are caged at his events. And given the tensions in this summer of rage already, it's inexcusable, indefensible, and gross negligence to stage one of these rallies in Tulsa at this time. Meanwhile, last night in Los Angeles, another police shooting, and this time a dead Latino, 18-year-old Andres Guardado. He was working as a security guard. We were told that he was not armed on the job. And he was patrolling an auto repair shop, which had been the scene of tagging and other issues that the owner decided to hire a rent-a-cop for. So a police department spokesman, now we have no video so far, and we only have the department's version of this. And by the way, it's the L.A. Sheriff, which is run by Alex Villanueva, and it's an agency with a lot of problems. Quote, deputies engaged in a short foot pursuit between the two businesses. They said the deputies saw the man produce a handgun before running away. And at some point, the deputies caught up with him, and that's when the deputy-involved shooting occurred. We don't know how many officers fired guns, how many bullets. The owner of the Freeway Auto Shop said, we had a security guard that was out front because we just had certain issues with people tagging and stuff. And then the police came up and they pulled their guns on him, and he ran because he was scared. And they shot and killed him. He's got a clean background and everything. There is no reason. The L.A. Sheriff's Department is also involved in the investigation into at least one of the two possible lynchings in Southern California in recent days. The sheriffs have jurisdiction over Palmdale, the North Los Angeles County desert community, where a black man was found hanging from a tree, Robert Fuller, 24 years old. And it was the L.A. Sheriff's Department that said, oh, yeah, that's a suicide, you can tell. But now they've been shamed into a fuller investigation, and it's getting national attention. Because prior to the Palmdale incident, there was a homeless man found hanged, and he's black too, in Victorville. That's about 50 miles east. And that's the home of the now shuttered Roy Rogers Museum, just for reference. But we're now seeing a possible pattern. A black teenager was found dead near an elementary school in Spring, Texas. A Hispanic man found dead in Houston. A black man was found dead in a tree in a Manhattan park. Officials in all these cases say there is no evidence that they were not suicides. Really? And across the bay from me in Oakland, California, several nooses were found on trees in the park near Lake Merritt. That was on Tuesday. And about 48 hours later, a dummy effigy was found hung from a tree. And the Victorville case, the homeless man, Malcolm Harsh, age 38. I'm just learning for the first time from this account in the New York Times that his death wasn't announced until 2 weeks after the fact. And then, as we reported yesterday, the half-brother of Mr. Fuller, who was killed in Palmdale, was shot and killed by an L.A. County Sheriff's deputy. They say that the man, Michael Thomas, had reached for a deputy's gun. But that's a little different because the original story was that Michael Thomas had pulled a gun. We'll see if body-worn cameras were activated or if there's any other video available of these events. And over at Mint Press, Alan McLeod adds a few details that I haven't picked up from other coverage. In the case of Harsh, the Victorville man, the explanation of suicide does not seem plausible. He said there are many ways to die, but considering the current racial tension, a black man hanging himself from a tree doesn't sit well with us right now. And his sister said, look, my brother is 6'3". That tree was 4 feet tall. My brother was tied to the tree with an HDMI cord. That's a video cord. Someone took their time with that knot, took their time tying this. It was too perfect, too perfect. So these are disturbing events. They also say that Robert Fuller was a tall guy. And we know that in the Fuller hanging incident, that there was no evidence that he could have climbed that tree or had some of a stool, a chair, a stepladder, or anything to jump off from in order to secure his own suicide. Shaking my head. The police in Louisville are moving to terminate one of the officers involved in the death of Breonna Taylor. The mayor announced it today, and they're not allowed to, under the rules of this termination process, to comment any further. The officer, Brett Hankison, was one of 3 cops who used a no-knock warrant to enter the apartment with a battering ram during a late-night drug investigation in March. And the evidence was so flimsy that they got the warrant for. It was just suspected that the home where Breonna Taylor lived had been the place where a drug package had been delivered. But no drugs were found in her residence, and it was her boyfriend who shot at the unknown intruders, who didn't announce that they were police. And then the cops responded with something like 8 bullets that killed Breonna Taylor, who was in a bedroom. We know that the Louisville police released a 4-page incident report of Breonna Taylor's death containing very few details, including listing none under victim injuries. And in Atlanta, where cops have been fired related to incidents from the protest and from the shooting death at the Wendy's restaurant of Rayshard Brooks. Well, a police foundation has decided to boost morale in the department by giving every officer in the city a $500 bonus. Is that like a brutality bonus? Keep it up, boys, attaboy. These are bizarre developments, I have to say. I want to credit Murtaza Hussain over at The Intercept for a detailed article on the 2 Brooklyn individuals who happen to be lawyers, who stand accused of tossing a Molotov cocktail into a police cruiser that was abandoned. And this was on the night of one of the protests around the end of May, May 30th. The suspects are a female, Uruj Rahman, and Collinford Mattis, a male. They are 31 and 32 years of age, respectively. They're both attorneys. No criminal records previously. And because of tabloid coverage in New York that's picked up by Trump, who then eggs on Bill Barr, this is being treated as a federal case. There were no officers in the car. The windows were broken. It was abandoned. And their Molotov cocktail didn't even really do much damage. It charred the dashboard before it fizzled out. But because of the federal prosecution, they are facing a mandatory minimum of 45 years in prison if they're convicted. A judge would have no choice but to give them that sentence. And Murtaza Hussain argues that this is a tool for the Trump administration to send a message to its political opponents. The government recently took the extraordinary step of appealing the bail conditions and sending them back into pretrial custody, drawing protests from 56 former federal prosecutors. So, I understand that they, if all the facts are accurate here, that they broke the law. But any punishment, any charges should be proportional. And they've been lumped together with another accused person, a woman named Samantha Shader, who apparently is charged with throwing a Molotov cocktail at a cruiser, an NYPD cruiser, in which several officers were sitting. I don't have any more details on that incident. So this push for law and order that is being showcased as the optics of Trump's reelection, as he styles himself after Tricky Dick in 1968. It's going to be with us for a while, I think. And also at The Intercept, another good piece by Mara Vistendahl and Aline Brown recounts the situation this past week. It was, I think, Monday, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And the man who fired shots that injured protesters who were trying to topple a statue of the Spanish conquistador Juan de Oñate, which is outside the Albuquerque Museum. Well, his name is Stephen Baca, and he ran for city council in Albuquerque last year. And in his promotional materials from the campaign, he bragged that he's the son of a former county sheriff's deputy. When I reported this the other day, it was described as the sheriff of Bernalillo County. Well, it turns out his father worked there for 20 years ago, but he left in 2001. And when he was picked up at the scene after he fired on protesters Monday night, he asked the cops to call his dad, whom he said was still with the sheriff's office. So the article goes on to describe how, with the protester named Scott Williams, bleeding in the street, the militia members who say that they were not aligned with Baca nevertheless formed a protective circle around him. And then when the real cops arrived, they created a second ring around the militia to protect them. The police handled the New Mexico Civil Guard, that's this self-styled militia, and the shooter very gingerly to make sure they didn't get injured while they were on the opposite side trying to target black and indigenous people. And then they cite the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights, which tracks white supremacist and far-right groups. They report nearly 200 appearances by vigilantes and far-right extremists at protests in the U.S. over the past few weeks. Then they quote Alexander Reed Ross, a researcher at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right, counted scores of such appearances, 12 of which involved police collaboration or support. So the cops identify with and relate to these self-styled, volunteer, heavily armed white groups. And There's an FBI classified counterterrorism guide that said domestic terrorism investigations focused on militia extremists, white supremacist extremists, and sovereign citizen extremists who often have identified active links to law enforcement officers. And so what we see here is collusion between these armed white extremists and the local designated law enforcement officials. There was one principled member, an appointee of Donald Trump, but she has submitted her resignation. The Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs, an African-American woman aged 30, Mary Elizabeth Taylor, who previously had worked for Mitch McConnell. Then she was at the White House shepherding over 400 appointments and nominees into the government for the Trump administration. She is a lifelong Republican. I would tag her as a movement conservative. But in her resignation letter, she said, "The president's comments and actions surrounding racial injustice and black Americans cut sharply against my core values and convictions. Wow. I must follow the dictates of my conscience and resign as Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs." Well, I'd never really heard of this woman before, but anybody who stands up to Trump and calls out, she didn't use the word racism, but that's what she's referring to, I think deserves at least a moment of praise. Want to issue a correction. I got punked. Yesterday I was talking about John Bolton's tell-all book, and then I referenced the new tell-all book by Trump's niece, Mary. And I was punked. I was fooled by a post I saw on Facebook that I later found out was satirical. The allegation was that Trump has lost control of his bowels. And I regret the error, but not too much. Because he's full of shit. Even John Bolton and Mike Pompeo agreed on that. And so it didn't seem too far out of the realm of possibility. Here's today's grant request from the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, supported by listeners who have subscriptions and others who've made generous contributions to the fund. And your humble host put some money into it, too. This is from Diana Raimundo. I was recently notified of doing to help the community during these difficult times. I'm the sole provider in my family, and like many people, I lost my job. I have still not received unemployment benefits, and I'm becoming worried. I'm a caregiver to my mother who suffers from health conditions. We're running low on medication. I'm not sure how much longer I would have to wait to receive unemployment. Anything helps at this time? Thank you in advance. Well, Diana, I'm happy to send you $100. I'll be in touch to see if you want a check in the mail or a PayPal transfer. But we wish you the best at this difficult time. And we're not out of funds at this point. So if you could use $100 to tide you over, buy some groceries, pay for those medications, put a little gas in your car, maybe pay the insurance, whatever you need to do. We have not declined a request so far, and I don't expect to. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com with your grant request. Well, I had a story from today's print edition of the New York Times announcing that the Air Force has launched an investigation into the use of an Air National Guard RC-26 airplane, which conducted aerial surveillance over Washington, D.C. during the recent protests. And this is the creep of the militarization of law enforcement in this country, and the creep in defiance of the Posse Comitatus Act, which nominally precludes the American military personnel and equipment to patrol the streets of the United States. And then, just as I got ready to come in here to record the podcast today, the news came over the wires. It's actually wireless here. But a late-breaking story from the New York Times reveals that the Department of Homeland Security deployed helicopters, airplanes, and drones over 15 cities where demonstrators gathered to protest the death of George Floyd, logging at least 270 hours of surveillance. What the article doesn't mention is whether or not they were using so-called dirtbox and stingray technology, which allows them to spy on every cell phone within radius of those devices. It allows them to capture your contacts, your location, the phone number. It can even read your emails or texts, and in some cases can invade your voicemail and copy that as well. This wasn't limited to Minneapolis or Washington. Aircraft film demonstrations in Dayton, Ohio, New York City, Buffalo, Philly. They send their video footage in real time to control centers manned by a branch of Customs and Border Protection called Air and Marine Operations. Then that is fed to a network managed by Homeland Security called Big Pipe, which can be accessed by other federal agencies. This is the vertical integration enforcement that I've been railing against for years. And they're the Joint Terrorism Task Force operations in more than 50 locations. And of course, this indicates that they believe that everybody who took to the streets is a suspect, which violates our constitutional rights in other ways. And that is the state of the art in the suppression of our First Amendment rights in America 2020. Now, Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York, rode into office promising to clean up the police. Stop and frisk was his major focus. And after he put an end to stop and frisk, he kind of stopped and ignored other important issues. So there is legislation that has languished at the City Council since 2017 called the Post Act. And it requires full disclosure of the New York Police Department's sophisticated surveillance and crime-solving toolkits, license plate readers, cell phone trackers, that would be your Stingray, drones, facial recognition software. I'm going to add here a network of cameras, some of which are privately owned, like in the Wall Street area where the banks have sophisticated security operations. And those are all part of a network where the city and the corporate security people collaborate. It is just amazing, too. I can, in some ways, be amused at people who came out to loot because of the fog and the diversion of most police officers to beating up protesters. And these people don't know about the surveillance systems. When they broke into a skate shoe store or stole a surfboard, when they loaded up their car with logo merchandise, and they didn't think anybody would catch them. I mean, there are TV shows where they freely present the details of surveillance networks in this country. How can people be oblivious to that? I scratch my bald head and ask. So Trump today announced that he will once again attempt to end DACA. He tweeted, "We will be submitting enhanced papers shortly in order to properly fulfill the Supreme Court's ruling and request of yesterday." And the rabid Deputy Secretary at Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli, tweeted, "We're on it, Mr. President." And so you can expect that in short order, unless his pollsters tell him, hey, Don, why don't you wait till after the election? This isn't very popular. But he believes his election relies only on his white conservative extremist base, and that he can't get hurt by feeding them the hateful positions and messages that they love him so much for. They love him so much they're willing to go to Tulsa and expose themselves to the virus. And I will note, just to be fair, that we are not seeing a massive spread of the virus because of the street protests of the last 3.5 weeks. I'm happy for that. But maybe that's one of the things that emboldens Trumpists to show up in Tulsa and take that risk. Now, speaking of the DACA decision, I want to recommend the analysis in today's New York Times by Linda Greenhouse. She's been watching the Supreme Court for decades now. And she writes, no doubt many eyes had glazed over by page 24 of the majority decision penned by the Chief Justice, where John Roberts' discussion of the reliance interests in favor of continuing the program that permits DACA-covered individuals to live and work lawfully in the only country that most of them have ever known. So the chief cited statistics filed by a group of 143 businesses, among other sources, and emphasized that those with a stake in continuing the program included not only the Dreamers themselves, but also their families, including 200,000 citizen children, employers who've invested time and money in training them, and state and local governments that would lose tax revenue from the earnings of DACA recipients. And Roberts wrote, administrative law requires the agency to take reliance interests into account. Quote, DHS may determine in the particular context before it that other interests and policy concerns outweigh any interests. Making that difficult decision was the agency's job, but the agency failed to do so. So this cleverly erects new obstacles to executive action because nominally, since DACA was initiated, executive ordered by Barack Obama, it can be rescinded through an executive order by Donald Trump. But because Trump didn't follow procedure, John Roberts was able to flush it. And Greenhouse suggests that this was John Roberts' way of saying to the president, don't take the court for granted. Don't expect that we will rubber stamp everything you want, just half of it. She writes, the DACA decision contained a message threaded through its dry language of administrative procedure, a warning to the Trump administration not to assume that it gets a free pass, not to take the Supreme Court for granted. Maybe you've heard about this. The Trump campaign is in trouble again for one of its commercials. Yesterday we were talking about the Facebook ads that include the Nazi symbol that was used to designate and undesirables, an inverted red triangle. Well, today the issue is that the Trump campaign released an ad that appears to be fake, entirely fabricated. It uses the CNN logo where they misspelled the word toddler. It's spelled with only one D. And it's a scene of a black and a white kid. They're maybe, 2.5, 3 years old. And they're frolicking on the street. And they basically run the video footage twice. And in the initial sequence, they have scary music. And the screen text reads, breaking news, terrified toddler runs from racist baby. And then the video shows in a replay of the sequence with the kids that they were, in fact, playing happily together. And the screen text at the end says, America is not the problem, fake news is. So this is a dog whistle to white racists saying that they're not racists. It's the media that promotes racism and reverse racism. That's really sick. Really sick. So, as long as we're talking about online activities, there's a really good piece by Kevin Roose published at the website of the New York Times today. And he notes how Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, they're just pouring money at nonprofits and other groups that promote racial justice. In the case of Facebook, the figure is $200 million. YouTube, $100 million. Jack Dorsey of Twitter personally pledged $3 million to an anti-racism organization started by Colin Kaepernick. But Roose writes, the problem is that while these shows of support were well-intentioned, they don't address the way that these companies' own products have been successfully weaponized by racists and partisan provocateurs and are being used to undermine Black Lives Matter and other social justice movements. On Facebook, for example, the most popular post on the day of Zuckerberg's Black Lives Matter pronouncement was an 18-minute video posted by the right-wing activist Candace Owens, who's black, where she railed against the protests, calling the idea of racially biased policing a fake narrative and deriding George Floyd as a horrible human being. And on Facebook, it was recommended to people and racked up nearly 100 million views. In all, he reports, 7 of the 10 most shared Facebook posts containing the phrase Black Lives Matter over the past month were critical of the movement. Over on Twitter, the company discovered a Twitter account claiming to represent a national Antifa group that was run by a group of white nationalists posing as left-wing radicals. And on YouTube, the most viewed video about Black Lives Matter this week wasn't footage of a protest or a police killing, but a 4-year-old social experiment by the viral prankster and former Republican congressional candidate Joey Saladino. It's got 14 million views. And, of course, I don't believe that censorship in general will work. But you go to YouTube, you watch whatever video you went there for, and then there's the on-deck column on the right. And some of it relates to the subject matter that you viewed, and other is just, coming out of left field. And a former employee at YouTube exposed how they intentionally use the data that they have on you to increase the tabloid nature of the offerings that they show you. And I've told you how Twitter is gratuitously sending me tweets from Donald Trump and putting them into my alert package. And Facebook's algorithms are often leading you to become friends with somebody, to join a group, and it's based on the data that they've collected on you. It's a really well-written piece, and I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast. I encourage you to check it out. Well, as we've reported, the Trump Justice Department there should just be a dash between the two. Trump Justice. They've been trying to find a legal way to block John Bolton's book from being distributed. So they went to court, and there's a hearing today, and a federal judge in Washington named Royce Lamberth held the hearing. And while he did slam John Bolton for not completing the process of vetting his book and getting written authority, he also said that while he's planning to issue a ruling later today, and I haven't seen it here at deadline time, he doesn't see any way how he can stop the distribution of the books, which are already shipped to bookstores all across the country and in other countries as well. But in Bolton's defense, he said he did make a good faith effort to go through the redaction process and that a government lawyer, a White House lawyer, told him that the final edit that they had completed on April 27th did not contain classified material. And then some other guy at the White House named Elias decided to review the review and is now claiming that there's all kinds of confidential, classified information in the book. Well, Mitch McConnell has been busy packing the courts, and he did it again this week as he jammed his 38-year-old protege, too tall Justin Walker, a native of Louisville, onto the second most powerful court in the country, the District Court in Washington, the Court of Appeals, in Washington, D.C. That is the 52nd. Young, mostly white, mostly male, appeals court judge who has been confirmed since Trump took office. And just by comparison, Obama confirmed 55 circuit court judges in 8 years. Those are the district courts, right? Well, no, if it says circuit, circuit is the appeals court. Anyway, Trump has now achieved that in nearly 4 years, and he has chosen more than 25% of the nation's federal appeals court judges. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, the scoreboard shows 8.5 million cases, 457,000 deaths. We have 2.2 million reported cases in the United States and nearly 119 deaths attributed to the coronavirus. The World Health Organization issued a dire warning today that the pandemic is accelerating. Thursday showed more than 150,000 new daily cases, which is a record. The world is in a new and dangerous phase, said the Director General. Many people are understandably fed up with being at home. Countries are understandably eager to open up their societies and their economies. But the virus is still spreading fast, it is still deadly, and many people are susceptible. A new study published yesterday in Nature Medicine reports that antibodies to the coronavirus may last only 2 to 3 months. We still don't have 100% confirmation that carrying the antibodies prevents you from catching the virus again. The results offer a strong note of caution against the idea of immunity certificates for people who have recovered from the illness. And I will note that what I've read about this study is that it's based on a very small set of cases. The Office of Special Counsel, a federal agency that reviews whistleblower complaints, has found substantial likelihood of wrongdoing by the TSA, where a senior official reports gross mismanagement of its pandemic response. The Federal Security Director at TSA, Jay Brainard, said the agency failed to protect its staff from the pandemic and, as a result, allowed TSA employees to be a significant carrier for the spread of coronavirus to airport travelers. His allegations include that personal protective equipment was withheld from TSA employees, local supervisors weren't permitted to mandate masks. And by the way, speaking of masks, the state of California, under the Department of Public Health, has issued a new order that affects people statewide. And this is really because Orange County refused to adopt a mandatory mask rule. And I have mixed feelings about this because there are many counties that have no recent deaths, no spike in case reports, and I think people will continue to widely flout the call to wear face masks. And I've seen the skeptics' coverage that, face masks don't really do much, and that because people wear the same one over and over again, that, the sanitary standards can be low. But fundamentally, I wear a mask so that when I cough or sneeze or just breathe, that I'm not spewing those droplets in your direction. And I thank you for doing the same. And when the FDA decided early this week to revoke emergency use authorization for chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, it left 66 million doses of the two malaria drugs in the federal stockpile with no place to go. And this is also a matter that is in dispute. I have read reports from people who praise the use of hydroxychloroquine in the early stages of infection. And while I'm not in a position to evaluate the science here, I fundamentally accept the decisions not to promote its use, even though Trump has personally experienced this medication. Where I sit is about half a mile from the notorious San Quentin State Prison here in California. And the number of positive test results for coronavirus has tripled since the 3rd of June. And this follows the ill-advised transfer of more than 100 prisoners from a different institution, the California Institution for Men in Chino. Many of them brought COVID-19 to San Quentin, which had only had a handful of cases up to that point. And the family members and attorneys for people who are incarcerated at San Quentin are raising the alarm. There has been a decision to release more prisoners to home confinement, but they're moving very slowly. And while the overcrowding at San Quentin has been reduced, there are about 3,500 prisoners there. It was once up to 5,000. Many of them still are housed in dormitories where bunk beds are lined up very close to each other. In March, around 40% of the prison population was housed in one of these dorm settings. And as of June 18th, the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has reported 3,332 positive cases, and 18 people have died in prison so far. Yesterday, Dr. Fauci apparently got out of line, and Trump has straightened him out, because he publicly said that it may be impossible for the NFL and college football to safely go forward with their seasons in 2020. And Trump has just basically sat on him publicly. He said Tony Fauci has nothing to do with NFL football. They are planning a very safe and controlled opening. However, if they don't stand for our national anthem and our great American flag, I won't be watching. What? How does kneeling for the anthem affect the risk to players and staff, referees, media, and fans if they let him into the stadium? He's just so ridiculous. Anyway, Fauci had said that he can't see a way how football teams can emulate the bubble protocols adopted by baseball and basketball in order to proceed. The NFL's chief medical officer said the league would have a comprehensive and rapid result testing program. Well, testing doesn't always find the people who are asymptomatic. Football's a contact sport. I don't see it. Now, back in April, we all learned for the first time about BARDA. That is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority at the Health and Human Services Department. We learned about it because Dr. Rick Bright got squeezed out of his position because he objected to the widespread distribution of hydroxychloroquine. So BARDA is now defunding research studies for treatments aimed at addressing the illness, not a cure, not a vaccine, but medications that can help people who contract serious cases of the coronavirus, where it attacks the lungs, filling them with fluid, robbing the body of oxygen, and that's how people die. So, in a shift in strategy, BARDA has announced it's halting funding for treatments in the respiratory zone. They've pledged $2.2 billion betting on a vaccine, and the funding toward potential treatments was at $359 million, but that will be reduced as a result of this decision. And I expected this outcome. If you remember, there was initially an investigation into Captain Brett Crozier, who sounded the alarm to the Pentagon that his ship, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, an aircraft carrier, had a widespread outbreak of COVID-19. And he was demanding to go ashore, to take the crew, and to try to deal with it. And they ignored him at first, and then ultimately they did what he asked for. And the early investigation recommended that he be reinstated as the captain of the Teddy Roosevelt. But now there's been a second investigation, which will appease Donald Trump. Captain Crozier will not be restored to command of the ship, and his boss on board, Rear Admiral Stuart P. Baker, will have his promotion to two-star admiral put on hold. You do not introduce a narrative that's not approved by Trump. In Los Angeles, a federal judge has been wrangling with the city for several months now, and they've hammered out an agreement that up to 7,000 homeless people will be housed. And the soft deadline is September 1st. This applies to people who are at risk for exposure to the virus, people over 65, those with existing medical conditions, and people who are living near freeways. They're going to find hotels and other housing facilities for them, and I think that's a positive move. I am really shocked by this. At midnight, on the last night of the legislative session in Nashville, Republican legislators rammed through a bill to ban abortion as early as 6 weeks after conception. That's before most women actually know that they're pregnant. The bill was not listed on the legislative calendar. The vote took place in a Capitol that was closed to the public because of the pandemic. Alexis Johnson, the acting president at Planned Parenthood, quote, "It's a disgrace that in the face of a true public health crisis, Tennessee politicians wasted their time with this last-minute move to attack abortion access before closing up shop on this session." And get this, they know that what they passed is going to be struck down by a court. And when it is, the ban will automatically be moved from 6 weeks to 10 weeks. Then if that gets blocked by a court, 12 weeks, then 15, then 18, then 20, then 21, 22, 23, or 24. This is an opportunistic effort to set up a Supreme Court review with the new Catholic conservative members, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Amy Klobuchar has made the right move after her dismal record as a prosecutor became part of the public record following the George Floyd protests. She has announced that she is removing her name from consideration as Joe Biden's vice president. And as I wrap up, I want to recommend two pieces for your weekend reading. One is the latest newsletter from David Sirota. He's based in Colorado, and his wife is a member of the lower house of the legislature there. So he's knowledgeable on what's going on. And he notes that the Washington Democratic machine has lined up behind former Governor John Hickenlooper. who has a bad record. He's a miserable corporate guy. He was one of the staunchest supporters of oil and gas exploitation in Colorado, and he's opposed by a pretty good progressive, a guy named Andrew Romanoff, the former Colorado House Speaker, who is a supporter of Medicare for All, a Green New Deal. But the Washington party leaders are putting their money behind Hickenlooper. Part of it is bad blood because Michael Bennet, the other nominally Democratic senator who ran for president along with Hickenlooper and had to drop out because nobody cared. Well, Romanoff challenged Bennet back in 2014. That can't be right. Anyway, he did challenge him in the past, and also Bennet was running the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. So it's an interesting piece that will shine a light on how the Democratic Party machinery falls in line behind the corporate types at the expense of progressives. And finally, I want to recommend that you go to the Gray Zone Project, thegrayzone.com, and read Ben Norton's latest dispatch describing the efforts at regime change in Mexico City. Now, AMLO, Andre Manuel Lopez Obrador, has disappointed in many respects. But he is the most progressive nationalist who has been president of Mexico in a long, long time. And he did give asylum to Evo Morales when he was the victim of a U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia last year. But there is an effort at regime change in Mexico City, and the documents that Ben Norton got a hold of show that they are counting on American support to pull this off by threatening mass migration of Mexicans toward the United States. That's how you get Donald Trump on board. So this is quite a revelatory piece, and I encourage you, if you have the time, to give it a read. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. I hope you do it every day if you can. You'll find it on YouTube, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.